League of Legends is a very competitive game. Generally, as time passes, one sees an increase in player skills, both professional and non professional, as prestige, dreams, and most of all, ego drive them to hone their skills on the Rift. However, the analytic ability of the League community cannot be credited with the same incremental improvement. This video will try to address the problem with League analysis at a broad level, then we move to a specific example, namely gold economy measurement, where we will provide answers to that problem with a type of model never truly utilized in the League community. In the community, when the common man thinks about analysis, they almost always include a form of data analysis. This is a problem because, unfortunately, most of the data presented, in the way they are presented, are either not useful or downright misleading. There are countless statistics available which claim to measure performance, but very few, if any, are taken as genuine performance indicators by members of the competitive community. Although I agree with this sentiment, no one, as far as I've seen, in the competitive community has been able to correctly diagnose the issue of why current data analysis practices are inadequate, especially to the depth to which the problem lies. But why is this? Is there any substance to my claims? And even if I am correct, are there any viable alternatives? There are, and this is what it looks like. But to bring it back, first we must appreciate the problem we're confronted with. We'll begin with the background information. What does League analysis look like as of 2024 and why is it lacking? Next, we explore physical modeling and why it can be more useful than currently used analytical methods. After that, we will introduce a new tool which utilizes physical modeling to map League's gold economy. I call this the standard gold function, or SGF. Furthermore, we will showcase the SGF's use cases and its improvement over alternate models of gold economy like the conventional statistical approach. And then finally, we will demonstrate a very simple and direct application of the SGF by comparing it to live game data. Let's begin by taking stock of current affairs. What is the state of analytical practice in League of Legends when players, coaches, analysts, across all castes of competence, reflect on the games they've played or watched? How do they generally approach it? What does it look like? Based on my observations, there are currently two categories of analysis in the League community. The first category originates from the player's perspective. This method primarily relies on heuristics to evaluate game states and in-game decision-making. The second category comes from the data analyst's perspective. This method is heavily influenced by orthodox statistical practice used in many academic disciplines. The player's method of analysis is very much ubiquitous. Anyone who has played the game for even a brief period can have reflective thoughts about the previous games and decide whether they think some in-game decision was either good or bad. Player analysis is integral to skill development. Moreover, the quality of one's analysis is related to one's game knowledge. This remains true whether one is a novice or a world champion. The player-based perspective is a direct carryover from their collective experience in playing and watching many games of League. How they play reflects how they think, and how they play is dominated by their gameplay heuristics. What necessarily follows then is that their analysis is as well. Meanwhile, the data analyst approach takes a very different view. Instead of using heuristics or player game knowledge, the orthodox approach likes to deal with easily accessible parameters that take very little background information into consideration. This method is left vulnerable to significant error whenever all relevant information is not appropriately considered. Unfortunately, this is almost always the case. I am very critical of this approach because it is very much the wrong tool for the job and fundamentally seeks to answer the wrong type of question. We will explore this in a bit. As a disclaimer, I do not think that data analysis is in general some kind of illegitimate discipline. However, I do take issue with a common understanding of statistics and people who perpetuate the kind of malpractice we have seen imported into League of Legends for years now. But the technicalities beyond the problems of orthodox statistics are for another video. But we will still be forced to contend with the unfortunate thought patterns birthed from that ideology throughout the video. Let's focus on the player approach. When a skilled player spectating a game of League of Legends considers a player's in-game performance, the spectator is essentially comparing his heuristics against those of the one playing. This involves answering the following implicit questions. Number 1. Does the observed player have the same understanding of the game state as they do? Number 2. Does the observed player make the same decision that they would given the game state? The former question is a comparison of the player's positional heuristics. The latter question is a comparison of the player's directional heuristics. Positional heuristics are the player's understanding of both the tactical and strategic position of the subject they're analyzing. For example, is the subject ahead or behind in resources like gold or experience? Which team has more map objectives? What is the lane state of the subject? Directional heuristics dictate a player's decision-making given the positional heuristics they condition on. For example, a simple directional heuristic may be to try to teamfight when your team has a tactical advantage, like having fewer ultimate abilities off cooldown. Another one could be to take Baron Nashor when the enemy team dies in a late game teamfight. Essentially, positional heuristics inform where you are, and directional heuristics inform where you should go. In a functional way, the heuristics are the player, and for this reason, we will call this category of analysis heuristics-based analysis. The reason heuristics are necessary is because they are fast, very fast. Compared to other cognitive actions like reflective thinking or logic-like reasoning, heuristics implement themselves immediately and automatically. However, this comes with a trade-off that they may provide suboptimal or incompatible solutions to the problems they seek to solve. Speed is traded for accuracy or optimality. An important advantage in a heuristics-based analysis is that because the analysis directly reflects players' heuristics during actual play, it necessarily carries with it an applicability to gameplay. The analysis will directly confer judgment on what is examined as understood by players' intuitions, and then that evaluation can be accepted or rejected on grounds of that specific game's context and that analyst's game knowledge. However, it has a big weakness in scalability. Heuristics-based analysis is unscalable in two ways. Problem 1, it takes a long time to become a competent analyst. It requires a player to gain direct experience with the game through many hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of play. And even if the hours are put in, there's no guarantee that any old individual will have the talent necessary to capitalize on that hard work. Heuristics cannot be easily taught through traditional learning environments like classrooms or textbooks. They include tacit, non-explicated forms of knowledge. Usually, even if the knowledge contents are known, heuristics are very hard to integrate without learned experience. For example, perhaps my challenger level coach told me to recall at a certain situation in a game of League. I now know the fact that that is a good play to make on the authority of my coach, but it's another thing to implement that information into my gameplay because I do not have the previous experience which would have led me to arrive at that conclusion myself. Without that fundamental experience to support, heuristics are very difficult to teach or learn. Problem number 2, even if one develops competence, in order to conduct analysis, one must watch each sample game in real time. A person working on 9 to 5 analyzing replays could maybe get through 16 games a day, assuming the typical game is 25 minutes long and given about 5 minutes for a write-up. Note that these are generously short time allocation assumptions. In other words, the cost of training to become a competent heuristics-based analyst is immense, and even if you manage to do that, there's a hard limit on the amount of games you can analyze as an individual. If you pushed it, maybe you can get through 20 games a day, but that's probably unsustainable long term. This is not to say that it is impossible, but the nature of this kind of skill requires the practitioner to acquire them through active participation. It is not enough for players to know what the quote-unquote correct play is as a piece of isolated information. They need the intuition which comes from the gameplay experience in order to codify the heuristic and have it become part of their skill set. Whether it is utilizing heuristics for learning, analyzing, or teaching the game, these actions demand long time investments which make the enterprises unscalable beyond the experienced individual. Basically, there are no easy shortcuts to expertise. The data analysis approach, or what we will now call statistics-based analysis, has the exact opposite characteristics of the heuristics approach. Basically, it has scalability because it can be performed computationally, and processing large datasets is trivial even for personal computers. If you've ever taken a look at the Riot API, there's a decent amount of information you can gather from a single game of League of Legends, and it's not particularly difficult to do either. Nor is it difficult to do for large sets of games, especially when you utilize third-party resources as well. This is a huge improvement in scalability from individual real-time observations. The problem, however, is that the statistics used in practice bear very little relevance to gameplay and gameplay applicability. Let's expand on this point. Data is only useful insofar as there are useful inferences to be made with it, and the problem, put in the broadest framing with the vast majority of statistical practice in the League community, is that with the data chosen, one cannot make the inferences which make direct judgment on players' heuristics and condition on all relevant prior information. What is often done instead is that a proxy statistic, which is easily measured and accessible, is used in place of some other parameter, less accessible or not yet defined, which would be a much better representation of what the data analyst was trying to measure. If we want to measure player gold accumulation, for example, there does exist a way to obtain that information directly in the form of a time series. There are good reasons for wanting such information. It directly reflects a common player state heuristic that is pertinent throughout any game. However, while there are occasionally some usage of time series in analytical work in the League scene, this is a tool which is severely underutilized, and the few times it does see use, it is not utilized to its full capacity. What is used instead are what I call the proxy statistics of player gold income: kills, assists, creep score, and towers destroyed. These parameters are sometimes used in conjunction to evaluate player economic performance in place of the direct measure. Although, counterintuitively, while the collection of proxy statistics are technically a larger quantity of data than the direct measure, by nature of many parameters versus one, the former provides much less useful information than the latter. This is because the proxies do not provide the player with any new information they would not have access while playing the game. The number of kills, or the event when someone is slain, is information that is practically plastered over the screen during gameplay. This is not something the player is ignorant to. It simply cannot tell anyone what was not already known. Therefore, it cannot yield new inferences that the player would not have easily made with the information available in-game. The kind of information a player wants upon review of her games is information she did not have access to previously. If she does not have new relevant information, then she will make the same inferences as she did before. But this does not allow her to change or improve. Fundamentally, what is needed is information which makes judgments on players' decisions, not information which merely recites the historical catalog of events back to the reviewer. This is one of the core considerations data analysts fail to notice in the context of League. This also leads into the second categorical problem, which is that most of the interesting information is not captured by conventional practice. But this is almost necessarily true if one has not recognized the first problem. Because how could one distinguish what is of interest without understanding why the information is sought for? To reiterate, a statistics utility, in our case, is entirely contingent on whether it can yield information which directly influences player decisions in future games. Win rate related parameters, which make up the majority of statistics offered by third-party data sources, do not meaningfully meet this requirement. This is probably the most controversial thing I will say in this video and the most disagreed with claim. This is understandable because it runs counter to most people's intuitions. Intuitively, winning seems to be an important part of playing games, and knowing whether a game was won or lost seems obviously to be relevant information to a game's context. This is not contested. Winning a game is the primary goal, by definition, of most games, including League of Legends. However, while it is the primary goal, knowing whether or not a game was won may not be pertinent information if the goal was to find information which could be used to improve player skill. This is where the key difference between the player in play and the analyst in review emerges. The goal of the analyst should have primarily to do with judging player decisions, for the sake of things like identifying areas where players can improve their play. In a game like League of Legends, one cannot meaningfully attribute the cause of victory or defeat simply from knowing the win-loss parameter. Even during play, the player is not necessarily focused on quote-unquote winning the game. In an abstract sense, he most certainly is. But the actual thought contents are likely closer to the direct gameplay elements concerned with obtaining advantages in service of smaller secondary and tertiary goals. There are two ideas borrowed from military science that I will use to further the point, which is the idea of the goal hierarchy and the concept of operationalization. Militaries and military affairs are very complex. In order to align actions across all members in a large institution to meet a specific set of objectives, modern military thought conceptualizes and organizes objectives and responsibilities into 3 layers of abstraction: the tactical, the operational, and the strategic. To put it in an oversimplified manner, imagine a fictional scenario where the leadership of the Kingdom of France wants to claim ownership over a territory currently held by their neighbor, the Kingdom of Prussia. In order to meet this goal, France decides to go to war with Prussia. In the war, France's general staff implements plans to defeat the Prussian armies. France's generals lead their armies in battle. During a battle in the war, a soldier of France fights alongside his battalion during an engagement with a Prussian battalion. In this scenario, France's claim of foreign territory sets a goal at the strategic level. When France goes to war, this sets another strategic goal as an extension of the previous, winning the war against Prussia. If winning the war is recognized as the strategic objective, then a particular battle of the war would become an operational objective, and winning a specific engagement during a battle would become a tactical objective. Now, from a purely analysis-oriented perspective, one reason why it's useful to organize goals and objectives in terms of abstraction layers like this is because while they are related events, they, perhaps counterintuitively, require very different considerations when looking at each in isolation. High-level officers, mid-level officers, and the conscript soldier will have very different perspectives and experiences as a consequence of their very different jobs on the events of the war, despite collaborating for the sake of the same strategic aims. Moreover, a success in one goal domain may not carry over to others. In our example, regardless of which side won the battalion-level engagement, the outcome may not have had any real consequence in the perspective of the wider operational battlefield. It could also have had great consequence. We simply lack the necessary information to make that determination with only tactical-level information. Similarly, knowing the outcome at the operational level of the battle may miss some of the tactical level information. Again, this missing information could be important. In other words, it is important to first identify the distinct layers of abstraction, tactical, operational, strategic, and to also draw the relationship between events in each layer in order to do coherent analysis. To draw the connection to the main topic, we highlight that current data analysis practice in League fails to conceptualize goal abstraction layers like of that used in military science. To be fair, there are the broad-level strategic goals recognized by every League player that are also considered in current data analysis practices. Everybody knows the primary goal is to win the game, destroy the enemy's nexus. However, the primary goal is abstract in the sense that it leaves it up to the player to find out how the goal will be accomplished. So, how do players meet strategic aims? It's simple. They break up the big goal into smaller, more actionable goals. Resource accumulation and denial is an immediate extension of the primary goal. Since having more resources like gold, XP, and map objectives than the enemy makes it easier to blow up their nexus. Then perhaps that goal is further partitioned into operational level objectives like winning teamfights or winning lane matchups. Further along, these operational goals may be broken up into various tactical level objectives. Data analysts make a mistake here by not operationalizing the strategic objectives into less abstract, more actionable operational and tactical level objectives. This isn't to say that strategic objectives aren't important, or that they aren't valuable considerations themselves, but data analysts currently present such information in an isolated manner. When isolated, strategic level observations bear very little meaning to the tactical and operational considerations. And this matters because players' heuristics primarily concern themselves with the tactical and operational level environments. Without drawing connections between the tactical and operational layer and the strategic layer, the isolated strategic level data cannot be interpreted into tactical and operational gameplay judgments and adjustments. To put it plainly, players cannot use such information to make actionable improvements in their play. In terms of examples of operational tactical elements, there are a few that come to mind without much thought. At the operational level, laning and teamfighting are the two most common environments in a game of League. They define some of the most recognizable moments in-game and serve the same overall strategic objectives of resource accumulation and resource denial. Tactically, there are considerations like positioning and damage trade patterns. Then it is simply a matter of operationalizing concepts as needed before we start implementing our new measures. In the tactical domain, concepts are practically pre-packaged into operable rules for measures. For example, trade patterns are very straightforward when it comes to modeling. One must simply define the initial conditions and accurately model the processes. While making this tool will, in practice, be very labor-intensive, there are strong arguments to pursue it anyway. If you are a high-level veteran of League of Legends, you do not need to be convinced of why such a modeling tool would be useful. Tactical level heuristics like Champion's trade patterns are a significant chunk, if not the majority, of what constitutes advanced player heuristics. The ability to validate or falsify player intuitions quickly, at scale, and outside the confines of real-time play would be a novel capability which could dramatically improve player skill development, especially at the highest levels of play. All this to say, one cannot simply take a binary win-lose parameter, correlate it to some easily retrievable event parameters, then take the average of a large pool of events in order to draw substantive inferences for the player or analyst. On a very technical level, for some different types of problems, there is nothing wrong with the orthodox approach. It works without trouble in situations where the problem is very simple, meaning there is very little relevant background information to incorporate. But in our case, we are nearly overwhelmed with tacit knowledge which is left unincorporated into any serious analytical work. Here the orthodox approach fails to give us satisfactory answers. It is only when one comes to realize the existence of a vastly superior alternative that he recognizes the problem. As we've mentioned, a win-lose parameter corresponds to a strategic level objective in-game. This alone contains no information that heuristics map onto, like trade pattern sequences or lane manipulations. None of these considerations are properly addressed in current practice. Again, this isn't to say that strategic level parameters aren't relevant information. In fact, the point of the video is to introduce a better model of resource accumulation than has ever seen use in League of Legends. So after discussing the limitations of current data practices, you might be wondering, is there an alternative? Recall, there are two modes of analysis in League of Legends, heuristics-based analysis and orthodox statistics-based analysis. The former provides relevant information but low scalability. The latter provides little to no relevant information but has high scalability. There's a gap to be bridged here. We want a new method which has both relevant answers and scalability. Upon meditation, or however else you get there, one might try the idea of creating physical models. Now, in the real world, to create a physical model, one needs a theory of physics. This theory needs to answer very tough questions that are not at all obvious. What is the system we are interested in? What are the objects? What are their properties? What rules mediate the interaction between objects and their properties? How do we measure these things? These questions can be difficult if the history of physics has anything to show. Fortunately, however, we are not concerned with real-life physics, but instead the in-game physics of League of Legends. This makes creating the theory much easier because there's some structural information guaranteed by the nature of League of Legends being a video game. At its core, it is a rules-based deterministic system, a computational system. This, along with the fact that we have knowledge of specific game parameters, such as champion stats, scripted game event timers, or item stats, means that the foundational rules of the game are already clearly defined and easily acquirable. This is just the beginning, because knowing the foundational rules the system is based on at the low abstraction level does not mean we immediately know their consequences at higher levels. There may be emergent phenomena as a result of some property interactions we are yet unaware of. Moreover, one must always keep in mind to make sure that the model is aimed to answer a specific question or set of questions before embarking on the journey to create it. We could waste an awful lot of time creating more useless statistics if we are not careful. With the background information and some of the reasoning behind our approaches explained, let's get into the details of the gold economy model, the main topic of the video. On a meta level, the reason this topic was chosen for the first video is because it is probably the simplest thing we can model. It's straightforward in its approach and relies on a short list of rules and assumptions. And, more importantly, this model was created with the explicit purpose of answering questions players should care about. Basically, it's the lowest possible effort for potentially high impact. The questions I asked myself when creating the model were like the following. How much gold should a player typically have at any given time? What is the maximum gold income from a single lane of farm at any given time? How does gold income change with respect to time? What is the value of a given amount of gold at a given time? These questions, especially 3A, highlight the desire to gauge a sort of baseline assumption of player gold income that can map onto any game of League of Legends. If we can set an explicit standard, then we can use that standard to compare the economic performances of players independent of the relative performance between opponents in-game. If you use the orthodox statistical approach, then you might try to take the gold acquisition rate, averaged across the entire game, and use that fixed number to represent gold income. However, this makes at least two implicit assumptions that are unwarranted. It assumes that gold income is static, which implies that the cumulative gold time series is linear. This is false because gold significantly increases in availability at certain points in the game, and by extension, so should expected gold income. Gold availability is also sporadic because of the design of minion waves, jungle camps, and neutral objectives. Moreover, there are significant differences in calculating average gold income if one fails to properly account for cannon wave timers. For these reasons, an accurate model of players' cumulative gold and gold rate must be a time series. It doesn't make sense to only use an estimator, like the mean, to represent data which is not intended to converge to a single value. Also, we will focus entirely on minion gold because it represents most of the gold available to most players, and it keeps the model quite simple. So we're directly modeling the potential cumulative gold from minion kills and passive gold income. The rules we will use are on the screen now. I won't go over all of them, but a few things to highlight. The change in cannon minion gold value and spawn frequency is largely responsible for why gold income increases as in-game time grows. From game start to 25 minutes, the total wave value of 3 consecutive waves increases by 56%. This is one big reason not to assume linear gold income across all in-game time. For modeling purposes, we will make the following assumptions on screen now. Again, I won't go over these, but in case you're interested, you can pause the video now and take a look. With the aforementioned, we have all the information needed to create a time series of the potential cumulative gold of a single lane of farm plus passive gold income in League of Legends. But we also need a simple iterative process which will sum up and record the cumulative gold per unit of time. Turns out computers can do this very well. Personally, I am a mediocre programmer, but the model is simple enough that it wasn't hard for me to get a script running on Python in short time. When plotted, the cumulative gold time series looks like this. From now on, we will call this the standard gold function. Feel free to pause the video and take a closer look. So now that we've finally defined the standard gold function, we can now discuss why it's useful. We are primarily concerned with how we can utilize the standard gold function to help make judgments on players' decisions. There is a separate concern, however, about what it actually represents. There's many viable interpretations, as we see on screen, but since we are mostly concerned with the utility, whatever we choose to be the quote-unquote proper interpretation is not that important. In practice, it doesn't matter which interpretation is favored because we will see that the standard gold function's use case is the same regardless. The important part is that it directly provides game state information which player heuristics try to emulate during play. This guarantees that the information will be useful to players. Players are always confronted with questions regarding optimization of play. With respect to gold, a type of question that will always be asked is something along the lines of, if I want to buy an item worth 1,000 gold, how soon can I purchase this item for any time in game? If you have the standard gold function, now you can answer this question as long as the initial conditions, like current in-game time and current gold, are provided. If one wants to calculate how quickly they can buy Lost Chapter, for example, the standard gold function can provide an answer to the question of when the player will acquire the first 1,200 gold under its assumptions. Assuming also that all 500 starting gold is a non-factor, the standard gold function provides the first 1,200 gold to arrive at 278 seconds, or 4 minutes and 38 seconds in-game time. Now with this information, players can set their future earliest expected item acquisition at around 4 minutes and 38 seconds. Perhaps surprisingly, the SGF seems to set reasonable expectations around item completion timings. And by reasonable, I mean that they comport with advanced players' intuitions about the standard timings. If we ask the SGF to predict these timings, we end up with these gold thresholds intersecting with the SGF on screen. Here are the details of the assumptions we made for the gold thresholds. As we can see, the thresholds happen to be a decent representation of item completion timings from a balanced game state. Now, to be sure, if the assumptions were played around with and changed here and there, you can make significant deviations for either the SGF or the thresholds. But it's impressive how well the model sets reasonable expectations of gold accruement despite only considering one source of it, even if it is the most significant source for most games. Although we have not considered any player gold data from past games, it seems that we already have a viable model of gold economy in a high farm, low intensity game, with only a few system rules and assumptions. This is significant because we have identified a tendency in gameplay as a consequence of the game system's rules, as opposed to aggregating statistics in the average of some thousands of compiled games. With this, we have introduced the first physical model in League of Legends, at least as far as I know. Recall that advanced player heuristics are difficult to acquire, but now some of them have been explicated in the form of this model. Now these previously difficult to acquire heuristics can be easily taught to people who have never even played the game. Another key difference between physical models like the SGF and orthodox data compilations is that they encourage significantly different kinds of inferences. The orthodox style is limited to summarizing what previous players have done in previous games. As a result, the common inferences which will follow will be overwhelmingly prescriptions recommending adherence to past gameplay patterns, behaviors, and decisions. After all, if one only considers the dataset to be relevant, then any information outside of it will not be discussed. However, the SGF is completely independent of any individual game data. In fact, it wouldn't make sense to call it quote-unquote data because that's not what it is. It, including all its assumptions and rules, is encapsulated prior information. This prior information tells you the constraints of the system and the limits of what is achievable under those constraints before you even begin the empirical process. What this naturally allows is a much wider array of inferences available in comparison to the orthodox method. Why is this? It's because the prior information in this case allows the analyst to consider game states and decisions that are permissible from the priors, not only the ones which happen to arise in the data. There are more advantages once the SGF is used in conjunction with player gold data in specific games. Player cumulative gold time series can be directly compared here. Even just graphically, you can see interesting information conveyed. The SGF seems to give a consistent visual guideline to compare player economic performance for any future gold data. This is better than player-to-player comparative data because the SGF and player gold function data subsumes it while being more flexible. Performances can be smoothly extrapolated across games, unlike previously, and any orthodox economic measure can be derived from the SGF and PGF. Once we have the player gold function data, we can use the following functions to further the analysis. Today we're only considering the ratio function, r sub j of t, and the difference function, delta of t. These functions serve as a basic performance measure. They are intuitively straightforward. The player should want to maximize both the ratio function and the difference function. In the last section of the video, we will see these measures in action. Before we go to the live time series model comparison, let's expand on three last points. First point, if you already know a player's gold function, then any proxy information about that player's gold economy is now redundant. In other words, there's no use in knowing a player's kills, assists, or creep score because they are subsumed by the player gold function. If you are specifically trying to measure resource accumulation like gold and experience, you should focus on the quantity of the resource and not the process used to obtain it. That is for a separate question. Essentially, you should not think of the kill itself as inherently valuable. Only the quantity of the resources that one obtains or denies is of actual significance. In this sense, player's gold time series gives more information than any single orthodox method, while simultaneously distilling redundancies into a single function. For future analysis, there is no longer a need to use statistics like CS per minute, number of kills, or any other statistic relative to in-game time as a state heuristic to evaluate performance. All one would need is the player gold function standard gold function ratio or the difference function. Second point, the standard gold function is a capable predictor of a player's gold curve under certain assumptions, but one could argue its true utility comes from its static nature. If minion gold economy doesn't readily change, then the standard gold function serves as a viable measurement tool of gold accruement, at least until Riot decides to overhaul the game's economy. Third point, there's a ton of interesting stuff to explore that I couldn't cover in this video. One of the topics I really want to cover in the future is the relationship between gold and time as a result of inverting the axes on the standard gold function. Although mathematically trivial, conceptually I think this has some of the biggest potential to influence the future of analysis in League of Legends. With all of that out of the way, we're at the last part of the video where we're going to demonstrate the standard gold function in live comparison to player gold function data. Last thing before we get to the footage, I'm just going to point out the labels on the plot. In purple, we have our standard gold function, and in blue, there is the player gold function for Brand this game. The SGF is going to look like a constantly rising step function, while the PGF will vary according to Brand's gold economy performance. Time is labeled little t, currently valued at 461.49 seconds. The difference function, delta of t, is unfortunately not the same as we defined before. The magnitude is correct, but the positive and negative signs are swapped in this demo, and please don't ask why. The PGF-SGF ratio function is the same as before, currently valued at 0.834. To keep the focus on the graph, we're going to run this at 2 times speed, and given the way it was recorded, the audio frequencies are distorted. If that bothers you, it might be time to mute the video for this section.
Like wildfire. Minions have spawned. I am free. I'm a short fuse. This fight is just one of many. trail. Like wildfire. This body is one. You can't contain me, suckers. I'm a short fuse. There's a tree. Like wildfire. This one is one of many. short fuse. This body is just one of many. The enemy has been slain. Like wildfire. I will blaze a trail.
This is the complete plot of the player gold function of Brand in blue. As asserted before, the SGF in orange is immensely useful as a visual guide. For this case, there seems to be a long period of time where Brand is below the standard gold curve, until about 700 seconds or 11 minutes 40 seconds in-game time. He continues along the curve until about 960 seconds or 16 minutes in-game time. From then, he stays above the standard gold curve until the end of the game. If this guideline were removed, all of a sudden we would lose all visual intuition we had before. What's left is a rough line that looks like any other linear growth curve. There have been attempts to remedy this by comparing player gold functions against each other, for example like you see sometimes in professional league broadcast. But without the SGF, that comparison lacks the consistency across different player performances. Player-to-player gold comparison data is useful, but it's not a replacement for measuring standalone economic performance. In order to extrapolate from game to game, you need the raw player gold function data. Moving on, here's a time series of the difference between the player and standard gold functions. We can easily see a big change at the inflection points at 700 seconds and 960 seconds as mentioned before. This is the ratio function. If you look closely, it tracks with the previous graphs, but I'll leave the in-depth analysis of the distinction between these two performance measures for another video. So by now, we can conclude a few things. Current data analysis practice in League is unsatisfactory because it fails to incorporate player heuristics and player considerations when formulating performance metrics. Relevant to this is a failure to distinguish between the functional abstraction layers in gameplay, strategic, operational, and tactical. Also related is the non-utilization of physical models to codify prior information before the data acquisition process. And then we walked through and demonstrated how it's possible to create new models without these mistakes. Finally, we explored some of the capabilities of the standard gold function when used with player gold data. Although we didn't get very deep on this, it seems that it already surpasses many measures used in current practice. We couldn't get to all of the uses of the standard gold function in this video, but I promise that we'll come back to this in the future. This video is very long, so if you're still watching, then I admire your attention span. But in all seriousness, there was a lot of effort to keep the topic on focus. There's a lot of content that got cut because it would have been just obscenely long. And in the future, I'm going to keep the videos shorter and focused on a narrower topic. Thanks for watching.